Hey, what's going on, guys? It's Jack. Back in to talk about how healing feels post-Exodia nerfs. If you guys missed it, where have you been? There's been a number of different changes to the Exodia comp, the Shadow Priest, Fire Mage, Guardian Druid, Holy Paladin, Augmentation Evoker composition to try to bring everything down a little bit. And as a result, I played with an Exodia comp on my Paladin as well as playing a little bit of Disc Priest today, and I wanted to see how everything really sort of came together and everything really felt. As a result, I started off by playing some Disc in dungeons, and I felt really good with the additional Atonement change, but it also was very noticeable playing with a Bear Druid. Most of the time that I played Disc this season, I was not playing with Bear, and it was very noticeable, of course, having the Atonement buff on hand, but also having like the off heals and just a really tanky presence in that slot where they're not going to require as much healing as opposed to something like VDH, which would. So I would say Disc, by and large, felt incredibly strong when I was able to look at my overall damage and being able to actually get a 450 beacon out of my vault today, which was amazing. But Disc's damage feels really good and feels extraordinarily competitive with Paladin at the moment. But as I started getting into higher dungeons, I really noticed how much damage was going out onto myself and onto the entire party, which I didn't feel like I had quite as many answers for as a Paladin would. Since a lot of Paladin's output is built off the back of like Holy Shock, Glimmer, things like that, it's a lot easier to be able to like pinpoint targets and then dump heavy healing into them, where Disc kind of struggles quite a bit more with that. And it feels like you're almost missing a button to be able to properly dump prio healing into whoever's going to need it the most, outside of things like Powered Life, which is there sometimes, but also has that health requirement that you have to be able to play around. So I got to do some 26s and 27s today. My overalls were getting like 60 to 65k DPS, which was incredible. For the healing checks, as long as I have all of these other additional abilities cast before the damage happens, my Shadow Covenant, even Schism, my Atonement's out already, then yeah, I felt like if I had Harsh Discipline prepped, I could absolutely top off health pools in a breeze. But there still is so much additional setup that sort of clogs up the rotation whenever you need to really crank output. And sometimes you can just like slam double radiances, especially with your 4 set, and be chilling and have a great time. And then there's other times where you get punished if you're using them that aggressively or using them specifically to spot heal. And so that was probably the biggest thing that is sort of a constant reminder, is that while this did get buffed, there's still, from the gameplay perspective, so many additional buttons that you need to be pressing and preparing in order to actually be successful. And then I swapped over to Holy Paladin, and I'm like, there's damage. And I can instantly just kind of look at my multiple 45-second to a minute-and-a-half cooldowns, decide which ones that I want to utilize, and then slam them down and be able to have a very fun, enjoyable experience because you have the burst. That was probably the biggest thing that I noticed when playing Holy Paladin today, is that the survivability, still insanely strong. Utility, the damage reduction you provide to others, and the burst output that you can provide to your group is still second to none in a key environment, and is a very large reason for why the spec is going to be healer players' favorites. Now, of course, there's going to be like the class utility that's being brought, the perfect dispel profile, the immunities, that kind of stuff, right? But how Holy Paladin is able to handle the problems that are thrown at it, whether you can switch into, burst AoE healing on a dime, or you can swap into prio target healing on a dime, is really unmatched by a lot of the healers this season. And I think that's a very big reason for why the spec is super strong and is going to continue to do super strong output and is going to continue to dominate. I think some of the stats are showing like 91% of the 0.1% title holders were Holy Paladins, and I honestly don't think that much of it's going to change. While you absolutely could be doing it with Disc Priest, you could do it with Resto Druid, you could do it with Preservation Evoker, absolutely. They're all competing with specs that are part of the regular Exodia comp. And so that's where it obviously is going to feel a lot less good, because you have so much of this spec competition that's going to be going on all at once. Now, Holy Paladin did get some nerfs, and it's not to say that you don't notice them. I really deeply noticed the damage nerfs that went out towards Consecrate. It was both a flat nerf to Consecrate's damage and a nerf to the Consecrate procs that you get from casting Judgments. And I absolutely noticed both of those pretty much right away in terms of my overall damage. You still have really high damage for healers, but you felt a lot closer to Disc Priest in terms of your overall, which isn't a bad thing, and I think that's probably one of the most justifiable nerfs that Holy Paladin received. That being said, I really didn't like how Tears Deliverance was nerfed, and that's probably my biggest gripe with how the changes went, because a lot of Dragonflight healing is exceedingly burst-oriented, and so when you're taking this great cooldown in Tears and turning it from a 25% Holy Shock buff, and Holy Light and other spells, to a 15%, it becomes a lot more noticeable in how much you can pump health pools at a very rapid rate and sort of be like rewarded for your preparation. And I also really don't like how insanely easy it is to triple your uptime with Tears Deliverance. I feel like that's something that they sort of like give you for free, which gives you almost like a skill cushion, in fact, because you don't really have to think too much about when you're utilizing Tears because it has such high uptime. You kind of just slam it all the time and it's just always there. And so instead, they nerfed the burst aspect of it, which helps save you, and which, in fact, would be a good reward for skilled play whenever you're in, like, a Forge Master Go Wreck or Spore Collar Xantia, something like that, where there's really heavy burst damage, and you can pump health pools up very quickly. You don't really have that reward on hand because they decided to nerf the actual burst aspect of Tears instead of nerfing the uptime. So I feel like even more than before, there's not really a lot of thought that you're putting into how you're using your Tears. Maybe a little bit if you're going to pair it up with Hand of Divinity for a purposeful burst, but then it just sort of like lasts for such a long time that there's not any sort of additional like push for you of like, oh, I really have to think about how I use this cooldown. And that's kind of how Holy Paladin's been working in general, is that you just always have some kind of cooldown, which feels good. It can feel dynamic sometimes, but I think that also just sort of highlights the lack of strength of the other healers, that other healers don't have so many of these small cooldowns to cycle between that are flexible to use for damage or for healing, and that starts highlighting the issue that I think a lot of specs are going to be facing, and hopefully it's something they can pay attention to for reworks or redesigns of talents down the road for Dragonflight, because when some specs are able to take pretty much like all of these talents at their disposal, use them for damage or healing, be very flexible with their resources, or even have a glut of resources like Holy Paladin, where you just always have Holy Power. Even the raiding Holy Pallies were ignoring Holy Power in some instances because they just needed to hit Holy Shock more. It does start highlighting some of the problems that can come by giving too much power in some areas. And then because they have too much power, they didn't want to do a redesign of the talents, and so they start flat nerfing the HPS of the spec as a whole. And so that's what I kind of think the problem comes about with Holy Paladin, is that, yeah, you can have all of these spenders at your disposal, but they don't feel super powerful. And they're nerfing your overall healing instead of nerfing some of the other specific talents, or at least not nerfing them enough. Or at least not nerfing them in the right ways. So in conclusion, for my day one impressions, I think Holy Paladin's not going anywhere when it comes to the meta. And in fact, I think that it's just going to further add more challenge for those players who are still pushing high keys for Holy Paladin, but also kind of taking the wind out of the sails for those who were kind of hoping for a meta shift, or at least a large enough one that you would see multiple different options sort of forming. Unless there's specific buffs that are strong enough to sort of like push people to reroll, or push people who are prominently playing off meta into the meta, then the meta doesn't really shift, and the people who have rerolled into Exodia are going to stay in that comp and still stay pushing, or they might just not push as well because they've been demoralized by feeling weaker week by week, which is the exact opposite of what we should be feeling. So this might be one of the most frustrating Mythic Plus seasons that we've had of all time as a result of Augmentation of Ochre and the result of all this surrounding synergy that's been going around. Personally, my plans are to hit 3,500 with my Paladin and then see how far I can push on Priest, especially if I can find a solid group to put together that is going to play some offshoot of the meta, but still be able to chess keys without too much problem. We'll see. But be sure to check out the live stream as well, and huge thank you to our patrons who are making all of this content possible for our quick meta update with 10.15. Thanks so much for watching, guys. Hope you all enjoyed it, and I'll catch you all next time.